Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have a big crowd today and a very exciting episode. This is CDR. It's an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the range of carbon removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals OpenAir is working on advancing really at every level of government here in the US, as well as in national and subnational jurisdictions globally. My name's Toby Bryce. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on policy advocacy with OpenAir. Everyone, if you haven't done so, please introduce yourself in the chat. And when you do, make sure you're directing your introduction to everyone and not just hosts and panelists, so we can all see, not just the host can see see where you're zooming in from. Just some quick background on OpenAir if you're not familiar with us and you're new to the program. We are a distributed volunteer network dedicated to advancing carbon removal. We're a global community. We work together on what we call missions, which are open source projects in the areas of research and development, messaging and communications, policy advocacy, and activist market development. If you look on our website, our founder, Chris Neidl, is running the chat. He'll probably put a link to our mission board. We've got a ton going on. You can start your own project. So we've got a lot we can do. It's a lot of fun. So we'd love to have you be a part of what we're doing. And there's a link in the chat, the join link. You can fill out a form, and we will give you a link to hop onto our Discord, which is like Slack, which is a communications platform we use to organize our projects. And we'd love to see you there. Before we start the program, as always, just the quick definition of what we're talking about when we talk about carbon removal. The definition here is from the CDR primer, which is an amazing online document that you can also get a hard copy of, and everyone should. That is it's a open source overview of carbon removal put together by over 50 experts, led by Jen Wilcox, who is now the Assistant Secretary of the Department of DOE Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Department. Carbon removal is a purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and to durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. This is also essentially the same definition used by the IPCC in the last AR6 Working Group 3 report, so we think it's a good one to work with. Two really important points when we talk about carbon removal. Number one, it's to disambiguate it from what is typically called carbon capture in the media and elsewhere. Carbon capture typically refers to point source carbon capture, meaning capturing CO2 from an emission source. This can be like a natural gas power plant or a cement plant. This can be a potentially important climate solution, depending on the techno-economic and socioeconomic context. But one thing it's not is carbon removal. And so carbon removal, again, is removing CO2 from the atmosphere. The second thing, when we talk about carbon removal, it's critical to state upfront that carbon removal is in no way, shape, or form a substitute for reducing emissions. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and decarbonize the global economy as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. That said, there's clear scientific consensus that we are also going to need carbon removal, and at massive scale, gigaton scale, that's billions of tons a year by mid-century. And there are two reasons for this. Number one, we're not going to be able to eliminate all of our emissions in a climate relevant timeframe. For example, the best example I think is of a hard to abate sector is agriculture and food systems, which are almost a third of global emissions. We're not going to be able to get rid of those by mid-century. So we're going to need some carbon removal to get to net zero by mid-century. Number two, we've already emitted well over 1 trillion tons of anthropogenic CO2 in the atmosphere. And as we can see, our climate is already in a dangerous place. And so in the second half of the century, we're going to need carbon removal to remove the trillions by then tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so we can restore our climate to a safer and healthier state. That's enough of preamble. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Irene, who is going to introduce herself and then also talk a little bit about run of show and introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Toby. Hi, everyone. I'm Irene Polney. I'm an OpenAir member and Ocean CDR advocate. Some housekeeping notes. Our format will be a short presentation followed by a few prepared questions and then a moderated audience Q&A. So please type any questions into the Zoom's Q&A box as we go along, not the chat. Also, this event is being recorded. We'll send the video link to everyone who registered and also post it on OpenAir's website and YouTube channel. This week, we are pleased to welcome Shopify Head of Sustainability, Stacy Kauk, who will present the company's recently published CDR buying guide and discuss the company's pioneering CDR procurement program and how we can scale demand for long-duration CDR. Stacy Kauk joined Shopify in January of 2020, where she's the head of sustainability and oversees and leads the company's sustainability initiatives. She also serves on the advisory board of the Carbon Management Research Initiative at Columbia University. Prior to joining Shopify, Stacy was head of the Ozone Layer Protection Program at Environment and Climate Change Canada. She has worked on several chemicals management regulatory initiatives and represented Canada as a member of the delegations for the Stockholm Convention and Montreal Protocol. And now for the main event. Thank you so much, Stacy. You can take it away.
Right on. Thanks so much for having me. And it's great to see so many people finding time in their day to join the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to test my skills with technology, share my screen and start the presentation. One second, and here we go. Okay. So let me know if you can't see this, but otherwise I think we're ready to roll. Okay, so as was mentioned, we recently published a carbon removal buying guide. We first made our purchases back in 2020. We started with a handful of companies, and today we've actually now made purchases from 28 companies, totaling over $33 million in contracts, which is made up of about 45,000 metric tons of permanent removal, plus others that may not meet that definition. So we've done a lot of due diligence. There's been a lot of negotiations, and we're now into monitoring the performance of our purchases and getting ready to receive some credits from solutions that have never been tried before. So what we decided to do was put this out there, and hopefully this will help other buyers and companies who are looking to get into carbon removal start to get ready to take some of those first steps. So how the guide is arranged, we talk about what is carbon removal, which Toby did a great job of at the top of the webinar. And then we walk through the things that are important to consider before you make a purchase, then how to make a purchase, and then what happens after you make a purchase. So it's like very pragmatic and full of tips and tricks and things and templates that can help you get started where you're at. So as Toby talked about, offsets aren't removal. We're not talking about carbon capture. We're talking about CDR. And obviously, very important, removal and reduction are not mutually exclusive. And if we can combine reduction with removal, we have a fighting chance at getting the world to where we need to be in the long term. So now for the fun parts. When it comes to before you're making a purchase for carbon removal, there's a lot that happens at a company. You often get different stakeholders who are skeptical. You get those pushing back, like, why would we buy something that's expensive when we can go buy a $2 carbon offset and call it a day and balance the books? Why are we doing this instead of focusing on emissions reductions? Or how are we going to do both? How does this balance with supply chain considerations? So there's a lot that needs to be thought about when you're considering making a purchase of carbon removal. And what's really important is focusing on the business case. And the business case is going to be unique for every single company because every company is unique. And some of the things that we rely on when we're making the business case is there's reputational risk related to getting involved in climate action as a company. We see it all of the time where a company decides to do something, goes out and says, hey, we're doing this initiative or that initiative. And, that initiative is better than doing nothing, but there's always criticisms that are going to be out there. So you need to think through what are the reputational risks and what are the criticisms that your company is willing to tackle and take on, and what are the ones that you can make smart decisions to eliminate. So one of the things that buying carbon removal can do is reduce the reputational risk from buying low quality offsets from even third-party verified registries. We've all seen that in the past couple of weeks, some projects getting exposed. Carbon removal doesn't rely on a counterfactual or baseline. It's either happened or it's not. Obviously, there's a lot to do with monitoring, reporting, and verification, and we'll get into that later. But you're not relying on a hypothesis that without your purchase, this wouldn't have taken place. This is clearly additional. The other thing that you need to think about is the relationship between carbon removal and carbon credits and how they fit into a net zero target or a corporate climate commitment that you're making. At Shopify, we don't have an SBTI net zero commitment. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. And the factors that really played into our thinking were, we're an information technology company. We're not making a thing. We largely have pulled the levers that we need to do emissions reductions, which are, having a robust renewable energy program and transitioning all of our server farms and data centers from, carbon intensive grid electricity sources to dealing with renewables. And so by doing a lot of those things, we've had massive emissions reductions at Shopify, and we could just hang out with our emissions reductions and say, yeah, we're going to have these emissions reductions done by 2030. And then in 2030, we'll buy some carbon credits and for our unabatable emissions, and we'll be good to go. But really what we wanted to do was design a program that was impactful. And we took a good look at our business and we're like, you know what? We need to get into supporting carbon removal. And that's the story that we're telling. And then one of the things that you need to do before you start making a purchase, and I think this is important because you don't want to get biased by narratives and pitches and the spin that can be put on a wide range of solutions. You want to set your carbon removal criteria. And you want to think about things like, are you comfortable with some solutions that offer 10-year permanence? Are you comfortable with 100-year permanence? Are you looking for 1,000-year permanence or like permanent forever, irreversible chemical reaction permanence? You need to have those conversations in advance. We're often quite comfortable with 100-year permanence because if we don't have the solution figured out in 100 years and the re-releases start, the runway, we're not going to need 1,000-year permanent runway. And so that those 100-year solutions are a really important part of a balanced portfolio. And I'll get to that on the next slide, but you need to figure out what your criteria is. And another criteria that's important to talk about is your price point or your average price that you want to pay for carbon removal, because this will drive your decision making. And it also is going to be really important when you're making the financial case to your finance team on, well, this is the size of our footprint. This is the budget we're going to need. This is the average price we're going to buy at, so that you can have that conversation about the quality, but then also those pragmatic pieces about affordability. So once you've got the foundation set of, what you're looking to buy and how much you want to buy and what you're willing to pay and the characteristics of the projects you want to support, it's time to make a purchase. And there's a wide range of ways to do this, and it has a lot to do with two things. One, your in-house expertise and how deep your science team is or is not. And how are you going to do the vetting process? Is that going to be internal? Is it going to be through consultants? Are you going to rely on the marketplace or platform that you make a purchase from to do that vetting and due diligence? And that's an important question. And then the other factor that you need to consider is the volume that you're going to buy. If you're buying small amounts, going direct to a carbon removal supplier may not be feasible, just because you don't have the buying power to go in and take their time up negotiating a bespoke contract with you. You may really need to think about going through a broker or going through a platform or marketplace to get access to the credits you want. And that's actually just more efficient. So we make some recommendations in our guide on, if you're going to be buying a lot, do these things. If you're going to be buying less, consider these other options. But by no means, there's always workarounds and ways to get what you need. So these are just guidance. One of the things I'd like to touch on here is getting comfortable with carbon removal, especially when we don't have clarity around quantification, life cycle analysis requirements, the methodologies for accounting for and issuing a credit. And one of the things that we've noticed is that it's really important to have a high level, to set a high bar of what you're willing to accept, and you need to have that in your contracts. Set a high bar of what you're willing to accept. Make sure that you have the option to audit, obviously at your own expense, but have the option to audit and view the documentation and take a good look yourself, or have your experts take a look. Because a lot of times carbon removal is being done for the first time in the field, and they don't know how the best approaches are going to be to ensure that a ton is a ton is a ton. And these things need to evolve. And what we wanted to do was still make a purchase without a known methodology, quantification, or verification method, but have that be a requirement that it has to be built while they're developing their carbon removal solution, so that we understand that a ton is a ton and we're able to have third-party verification. And if we were to wait until there was an accepted methodology and a public registry for every carbon removal solution, that would be very much a sequential approach, and we don't have time to go sequentially. We need to build the airplane while we're flying it, and carbon removal is a great example of needing to develop many things at the same time of actually delivering the solution. So that's a little bit about MRV, and I'm assuming we're going to have some questions about that. So really happy to share further on how we're thinking about it. And so then the next part is, when you have made a purchase, depending on what you're buying or how much you're buying, you may have made a commitment that you're only paying upon credit delivery, but you may have also put down a down payment. You may have negotiated milestone payments that, as the carbon removal supplier is proving their concept, you start paying a little bit more, and then you start getting credits delivered in years to come. And so with that, with those different ways to set up your purchases, they have different monitoring requirements. Now, if you've done a take and pay type contract where you pay upon delivery of the carbon removal credits, you're really going to be doing that verification at that point, that gate where you're making the payment and you're accepting delivery of the credits. But if you do enter into some of the more catalytic ways of spending, and that is to sort of prepay for some of your credits, you're going to want to follow along, and you're going to want to have milestones where you are receiving information from the carbon removal supplier on a regular basis about how they're doing. Have they met all of their engineering design milestones? Have they met their construction milestones? How's the commissioning going? Do they have all of their permits in place that the local regulations are requiring for them to operate? And so you want to keep tabs on all of these things. So you need to monitor your portfolio along the way for any early signs of delay or concern. And, you know, one of the ways that we think about it is, there's going to be delays, and there's probably going to be missed milestones, because often these companies are doing something for the first time. There's not a manual out there about, oh, this is how you do ocean alkalinity enhancement at scale, and here's how you do all the MRV. No, we don't know that yet. So we're learning as we're going. And so that's why it's so important to have monitoring in place, so that you can follow along and understand and decide if you're comfortable continuing that contractual relationship, or if it's time perhaps to say, you know, this isn't a delay that we're able to tolerate, because we need those carbon credits to retire them, say in 2025, against our corporate footprint. So we're going to have to go elsewhere. But without monitoring, you won't know until it's too late. So this is a really important aspect of the program. And then, you know, if everything goes well and you start getting these credit deliveries, you're going to have to figure out the verification and the rigor you're going to apply to that. And then when you retire them against a corporate activity, we think about it in that there's different levels of risk. Like, we have a carbon neutral commitment for our scope 1, scope 2, and some of our scope 3 emissions. Those credits retired against that annual footprint need to be reasonably airtight as we can have them. We don't want those to be credits where down the road we find out, oh, there's a reversal event, or, oh, the baseline was wrong. Those are credits that we need to be able to try to really rely on. But if we're doing something that's maybe more promotional, doesn't have like a carbon neutral commitment to it. What we're able to do there is we can be a bit more flexible because there's less risk to the brand and risk to the company. So we think about what kinds of credits from which kinds of solutions we're retiring against which activities and what we're saying about them in order to make sure that we're reducing risk to the business. So that's sort of what happens post-purchase. And that's an overview of what's in the buyer's guide. I encourage everyone to check it out. We even have a sample contract in there. We also have a sample scorecard of all of the milestones and performance criteria that we monitor with our 28 portfolio companies. So there's a lot of applicable things in there that you can take and adapt or look at and go, that doesn't work for us, but we're going to do this instead. At least it's a starting point. So there we go.
That was great. Thank you, Stacy. And also just this has been echoed in the chat as well, but thanks to you and your team and also to, Shopify's founders, Toby with an I and the rest of the executive team who have been, launched this program that has been so impactful that is completely voluntary that you didn't have to do so. It's much appreciated, I think, across the sector. And thanks again for the presentation. Can you, we always ask a little bit of a personal question to start out. Can you talk about, you have a really broad background. You studied environmental engineering at university, you've worked in the private sector, you've worked in the public sector, and you came to CDR. Can you just talk about a little bit about how you made that journey and when you first learned about CDR and what made you decide that you wanted to, devote the next few years of your career to it?
Sure. I've always been oriented around natural systems and the environment. I like math. That led me to engineering. But I like to move quick and I like to do new things. And that's sort of been a lot of the thread through my career. I started as a consulting engineer doing detailed design work in the field for industrial sector clients and massive infrastructure projects, and seeing the practicality of what scale can be for things and to see how things get built. I really enjoyed that. But then I learned about the cost of environmental protection because I was always being asked, oh, this is really expensive. Does your design really have to do all of that? What does the regulation say? Do we really need to do all of that? And I got really good at finding the loopholes and the exclusions and how to work around things. And I woke up one morning, I was like, oh man, not using my powers for the right team. I need to, figure out a way to apply this in a way that has positive impact for the world. And that's how I try to decide how to spend my time. Is this maximizing my impact? And I ended up going to the government, like you said, Toby, and I was basically just on the opposite side of those regulations, working with industry to tighten them up and phase out toxic substances and reduce emissions. But then I started bumping up against multilateralism and consensus-based decision-making on the international stage. And I started to get impatient. And I was like, this is slow. We have a really big problem. And I started to ask myself questions of, is there another place that I can apply these skills and have impact? And carbon removal really piqued my interest for a few reasons, because it has an engineering base. So I get to dig into all of the nuts and bolts and the guts of these solutions, which I absolutely love. But I also know what it takes to get regulatory approval, to have tax benefits for a sector. How do you design regulation so that it's performance-based and not overly prescriptive and can't evolve with a sector? So I have this weird mashup of skills that a new industry like carbon removal, I felt like, oh, I can do something here. And working at a place like Shopify, where there's not a lot of rules. And if it makes sense from a first principles or systems approach, that's what we're going to do, even if nobody else is doing it. So it's a really great environment for me to be able to take chances and shine lights on amazing carbon removal companies and to look at contracting differently and to try to be catalytic. And I don't think there's going to be any shortage of challenges here. So I won't be bored for a while.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah.
And can you just give a quick recap of the origin story of the sustainability fund at Shopify? Like, why did Shopify start doing this, and how did you connect with the company?
Yeah, definitely. So the Sustainability Fund is a $5 million fund that we commit to spend every year on the most promising solutions. And it came out of a journey that the company was on before I joined. And they were doing all the carbon accounting. They were getting all the data, crunching the numbers, doing the emissions. And then their question was, well, what have we emitted as a company since we were founded in 2004? Okay, let's get that number together. Okay, well, we should be responsible for that. Let's be a carbon neutral company and let's go out there and counteract our emissions. And then it was like, okay, well, let's go see what we can buy. And then the reality of avoided emissions offsets started to bubble up. And this would have been back in 2017, 2018. And the question our CEO asked was, well, why would I pay somebody else to not pollute as much as we just did? And it's a valid question. And there is a place for that financial mechanism to kickstart the adoption of technologies in hard to abate sectors, for sure. However, when you're looking to make good on your historical emissions, that may not be the right mechanism. And then they came across, well, let's just pay somebody to remove it. Climeworks is a thing. They'll suck our emissions out of the air and put them underground and we're good. And then it was like, oh, well, we can just buy that. And then they tried to buy it and it was like, well, okay, there's actually really no carbon removal happening. In reality, it's all on paper, it's all in labs, it's all in academic settings, and we can't actually buy the product we want. Nobody else is even really buying the product. And so it was this idea of using market forces, which is what Shopify does. We're a commerce company, using market forces to demonstrate that demand. So it was thought that this $5 million spend commitment on an annual basis would be a signal in a non-existent market that, hey, we're going to spend $5 million every year on this, so you should make it, you should build it. And that's sort of what we're starting to see now. Things are taking off.
That's great. Thank you. And just one quick inside baseball question. So since the formation of Frontier, is all of the Shopify Sustainability Fund procurement activity channeled through Frontier now, or do you still do things independently as well, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's two angles to it. The Frontier definition of carbon removal is that 1,000-year permanence, a path to being, I think it's 500 megatons or gigaton scale, a path to $100 per ton on the CapEx and OpEx of the solution. So it's a very tight definition of carbon removal. And one of the principles of our approach is we think all of the solutions need support, and even ones that the science is still evolving around those questions of permanence and scale. And so we have solutions in our portfolio that go all the way from forestry-based solutions, soil carbon storage, biomass, bikers, biochar, ocean-based solutions, biomass sinking, DAC, and product usage. We have the full range, and Frontier doesn't cover that full range. So we're going to continue with our original thesis, but Frontier is our preferred procurement vehicle for carbon removal solutions that meet that target. So we've got our base fund of $5 million every year, and then we have an additional financial commitment to spend before 2030 that combined across the 5 founding members totals $925 million.
Got it. And I love the more ecumenical approach. I think that's really very much needed because not everything has to be 1,000+ year permanence, as you pointed out. And so will you do, it's like, are there solicitations that open up for the existing sustainability fund, or is it kind of ad hoc purchases, or how does that work?
So that's a good question. We started back in 2020, we did almost an invite only RFP process. Then we went to a fully open gated RFP process in the next year in 2021, which we announced, I guess, at the end of 2022. And that process was anybody could apply. We asked for basic information. And then if we thought it was promising, we invited you to submit all of the detailed all the detailed data. And so now we've got these and we've also done at one-offs out of nowhere, just because something's new and exciting and we've got extra budget left over. So the planets aligned. So like we've done all of it. And right now we're trying to decide, there's a few things in play. So I don't have a clear answer on when our next round will be. I don't have a clear answer on format. I do expect there will be some kind of open call, but it may be very targeted. And here's why. So we did our original purchases initial round in 2020. Lots has happened in 3 years. These companies that we have in our fund, the 28, some of them are now actually doing the thing in the field, going to actually see if it works or not. Does it perform as models have predicted, or is it going to underperform? Are the economics going to work out? How's the business case holding up? We're going to see, I think, a lot of rubber hit the road for companies in the next 9 to 18 months, which is going to change the makeup of our fund. Some companies are unfortunately going to find out bad news, this isn't going to work, and they're going to exit. And when that happens, that's going to free up budget. And we're also going to need to replace those credits we were expecting to get. So there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment in our portfolio, which means that as some succeed, we may buy more with them. And as some find out that maybe there's a different thing they should focus on, we won't be making that purchase. And so there will be a lot of room and change. But the principles that we're going to apply to this is we want to have a balanced portfolio. So we do want representation across all the range of solutions. And then within each solution, we're looking to have a diversified tech stack. We're not going to go out and buy credits from companies that are doing exactly the same thing. We're going to take the different technologies within the verticals. So as things are proven and disproven over the next 18 months, we're going to end up with gaps. And either we need a new company to fill that gap in that exact spot, or the world's going to know that, well, that's actually not going to work. So we're not going to be doing that anymore. And then we'll be looking to beef up our investments elsewhere.
Great. Thank you. That's very helpful to understand. Let's talk about, so we have some great buyers in the market, like, you and Frontier and Microsoft, et cetera, Swiss Re in Europe, but we need more. And actually next week's guest, Robert Hoagland, had a good post that I'll put in the chat right now, actually, recently talking about what is keeping more buyers from entering the market. And I think your buying guide kind of implicitly addresses many of these points, but his 4 main obstacles were: number 1, fear; number 2, lack of incentives; number 3, challenge/difficulty of what you guys do, which is evaluating all of these disparate proposals and understanding them and figuring out which ones are the right ones to support. And then finally, which I think is a big one, price. Do you agree with these? Do you think, are there others that you think are there other obstacles that you think are out there? And, of these or the other obstacles, what do you think are like the big things that are keeping more buyers out of the market?
I do agree with all of those as being things that are barriers to entry. But I also think there's some systemic problems that we have, since it's voluntary and the voluntary carbon market, we're lacking definitions on, there's best practices, but we're really lacking things with teeth on both sides of the carbon accounting equation. On one side, when you're doing corporate carbon accounting, you can define your carbon neutral commitment as whatever you want. It's really important to be transparent and say, this is what's in, this is what's out. Here's the boundaries into what we'll be responsible for. So the demand, like how many credits a company has to go out and buy is unique to them. And the decisions that they've made and the commitments that they're doing, there's no consistency. So there's that on one side. So you don't have that size of the demand being consistent. But then on the other side, we don't have consistency or clarity around, and this kind of gets into the pricing, but we don't have consistency around what kind of credit can be applied against that corporate climate commitment. What is the durability? What is the quality? What is the permanence requirement? Like it's all, you can buy whatever you want. And so when there's a lack of consistency on that side, you get we have two big price buckets right now. We've got very cheap options available, say around $10 to $20, $30 a ton. And then you have new novel solutions that are early days that cost over $2,000 a ton. And so why would you buy $2,000 a ton versus the lower part? And I think in the long run, we'll see some convergence over like what's an acceptable credit. And we'll see prices get stratified based on, say, permanence or durability. We'll see how that gets defined. But so what I'm getting at is with those two different price buckets, if you're just going to be focused on that carbon neutral commitment and you have a set budget, it drives you to a certain price. But if you're future-proofing your company, and then this is where that science and vetting and that component that is a barrier to participating, in order to play in that higher price point, you really need to know what you're buying, and you need to be able to have a part of the long-term upside of being an early buyer. And that's what I talk to a lot of companies about. And this kind of protects you against all of the things that Robert's flagging in the long run, is that if you get in now and you make some purchases and you start to understand in 2030, when all these net zero commitments come home and everyone's scrambling to buy, perhaps you've got a right of first offer or a right of first refusal on credits. Perhaps you already have a great relationship with the supplier and you're going to be able to get the credits you need. And so that's part of it too, is to take down that fear and start working on solving those barriers now so that you're ready down the road. But I think, I only think that's going to be adopted by the majority when the systems on both sides of that equation get solidified.
Yeah. Good answer to an unanswerable question, but I think those are like really great perspectives. In terms of the system, I think everyone understands and acknowledges that for carbon removal to get to anywhere near gigaton scale by mid-century, the public sector is going to have to be the primary driver of that. Right now, Frontier, you and the other companies I named are really powering the voluntary market, but there's no way the voluntary market on its own will scale to gigaton scale. So obviously we need the public sector to get involved. Open Air has worked on a variety of demand support policies, including public procurement. We have a bill that just got introduced in Massachusetts, and that's, basically adding more Shopify and Frontiers to the market at a relatively small scale. Are there any policies to kind of address some of the issues that you highlighted in your last answer? Are there additional policies that the public sector can be contemplating that would help get more buyers into the voluntary market in the immediate term, which is kind of what we need, because we're not going to get the public sector spending tons and tons of money it's going to take time. But are there things that the public sector can be doing now in the coming years that will make it easier for more voluntary corporate buyers to start supporting carbon removal?
Yeah, I think there's two things. And one is a policy side, and the EU is really starting to talk about this, where companies make claims about their product or their operations, and there is a lack of definitional consistency. There's a lack of transparency around that. Is that product truly biodegradable? I mean, that same concept applies to, is that company really carbon neutral? And so I think that there's a lot that can be done in policy to kind of firm up what the basic requirements are to make those kinds of claims. And that should be what drives corporates into carbon removal, because we have to have a conversation about what kinds of credits qualify. Is it something that's low climate benefit, over credited, the baselines are off, not additional? Is that fine just because it's on a registry? Or are we going to have policy that tightens that up as well? So I think that's really important. And then on the other side, and maybe a lot of regulators need to do this as well, we need to have some education, some foundational education for the policymakers in order for them to really be able to understand what's needed. We're still talking about the definitions of end of point, end of stack carbon capture and carbon removal. Like we're still at the base understanding of, well, where does the carbon dioxide come from?
Right.
You know, we're still having that conversation, which means to me, a lot before we can have successful policy frameworks to drive more buyers to carbon removal, we really have to shore up the basic understanding of carbon removal, what it is, and the role that it needs to play.
That makes a lot of sense. That's great. Could ask you questions all day, but I want to leave some time we have a bunch of audience questions. So Irene's going to come on now and start asking you some of those.
Amazing. Thanks, Toby.
Sure. Thank you. Are you there, Irene?
Thank you so much, Toby. So for so nicely preempting a lot of these audience questions as well. One kind of higher level question, Stacy, from Colson is, how do you envision carbon markets changing in the next 5 to 10 years? And do you think they will be exchanged and or priced differently?
Oh, I love thinking about this, and my views change almost daily because I think the carbon removal landscape is just changing so rapidly right now. But there's a few concepts that I expect to see. I think we will see the price for higher durability carbon removal to come down, because I do believe we're going to start seeing some of these solutions start to scale and to come down the cost curve, which should then bring down the price, which will happen. Whether we get to $100 per ton, I'm not convinced that that's necessarily going to happen, because that relies on a lot of external factors like the policy environment, tax incentives, things like that. But I think we will see that come down. And I think we will see some of the solutions that are potentially lower CapEx. So, you've got DAC, that's high CapEx. And, you're spending almost $1 billion to build a 500 megaton facility, and then you're going to operate it for 30 years. There's some solutions like ocean-based solutions that don't cost $1 billion to stand up in year one. They have more operating expenses potentially, but those ones have the potential to scale. And if some of these are successful, I think we're going to see an uptick in high quality credits coming to the market at reasonable price points, which I think will then exert pressure on other kinds of carbon removal to incentivize them to come down the curve. But what I think that's also going to do is we're going to see market clearing purchases by big buyers start to happen, where full projects or full years of companies' inventory will be bought out in advance. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think I'm hopeful that all of these frameworks are going to come into play, and there will be a requirement for high quality carbon removal. And once we know what that is, and once we're required to do it, it's going to be a competitive market where we're going to see all of the credits get cleared in order of lowest price, highest quality. They're gone. The next are gone, the next are gone. And then you're going to be left with low quality or the highest priced, high quality ones. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
Super interesting. There's so much to unpack in that answer. I think related to the standards that you had alluded to earlier and just now as well, we have a question from Carolyn, who's asking about the ICVCM. So for folks who aren't familiar, Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, and some other standards bodies, clarifying some of the challenges you mentioned around standards. How, if at all, will these core carbon principles and claims guidance affect the removals market? Are they having an impact?
I think what we're seeing right now are companies trying to minimize risk around those proposals. They're starting to see these conversations happen, which means more companies are like, ooh, we're probably going to have to start buying that thing. We're going to have to start buying carbon removal. And so we're seeing a lot more interest because of those initiatives. And I think we have two groups of buyers. We have ones that are seeing this and are like, okay, we're going to start buying. We're going to hedge our bets. We're going to get in there. We're going to start getting some. We're going to get some contracts in place, so we've got supply locked up down the road. And then we have another set of companies that are only going to do it when they have to, when they're regulated. And that usually is lower margin sectors why would they go and make these expenses when it's not required and nobody else is doing it? They just lose profit. So we're going to have these two groups of customers moving separately. When it comes to the voluntary market, you're going to see, I think, more participation from forward-thinking companies who have a history of trying to hedge their bets and trying to future-proof their business. So it'll be things like you're seeing now with tech companies and those kinds of groups getting involved. I think we'll also see the financial sector get more interested as these transparency and integrity requirements ratchet up. It's going to make it a lot easier for these to be tradable units. So there's going to be some groups hedging their bets on making profit by now, sell a little bit later, and make some money on the market.
That's great. And related to that, there's a question from Mark. Do you feel the voluntary CDR credit market will hold up if and when we enter a recession economy? What do you think about that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think since the definition of a recession usually follows about 6 months after it actually happened, we may already be there. But I think companies, like I can speak for Shopify. I mean, we have a plan to be a 100-year company. We do not sacrifice that long-term objective for a short-term gain. A recession does end, but your climate commitments don't change. And that's part of being a company that's taking care of their future and their customers, is making sure that you're addressing climate. So I don't think we're going to see a slowdown in terms of companies that have already made commitments or already have allocated funding to take climate action. I think we will see companies who may have considered joining when times were good and buying carbon removal, they're going to delay. But I don't think we're going to see exits.
Got it. Getting to some pathway specific questions, we have a few questions about the different CDR pathways. You alluded to Ocean CDR, my favorite, earlier, and we have some folks asking you if you can, based on your experience and what you've seen so far in terms of progress, could you speculate in terms of which types of methodologies are you seeing that might have the, exceptional promise either in their efficacy or cost?
Oh, so much fun. So I think what is shown, there's a lot showing promise. I mean, we have an expected commissioning timeline for a direct air capture facility in the Permian Basin through 1.5 in carbon engineering in 2024, right? That is going to turn on and maybe work in the near future, which is really exciting. We also have things happening in the ocean space that I know you're aware of, Irene, but we've got companies actually doing pilots. They've come offshore, they've come out of the lab, and they're doing the thing in the ocean. And that is going to bring back results. And if we're able to actually quantify the effectiveness of, say, ocean alkalinity enhancement, or prove that biomass sinking is ecologically safe, if those results start to come out, the scale of those solutions is massive. And so if we start seeing those positive things happening, I think we're going to see those take off at a very fast pace. We're also going to see that with biomass-based solutions, I think, because there's a lot happening, especially in forest fire regions where there's a lot of biomass, there's a lot of co-benefits. Biomass, they're getting very creative about where that can go and what we can use it for, which is we get obviously going to get into questions of additionality, but I think that we're years away from having forests being purposely thinned to do biochar production, for example. We're not there yet, but there's a lot happening there, which is very positive. But there's also things like enhanced weathering, which up until recently were theoretical or in the lab and not being done in the field. And these things are starting to take off. And again, it's like ocean. When you harness an existing natural system and enhance it and speed it up, there is just such an ability for scale. And enhanced weathering is another great example of just such great potential for scale. So I'm very excited about a lot of those hybrid solutions that are enhanced natural systems, but I'm also really excited to possibly have a second direct air capture facility in operation in the world, so that we can learn if that's going to be a cost-effective or meaningful component of the solution set that we're preparing.
Excellent, very helpful. And a lot of the pathways you mentioned sort of combine the capture and the storage. One question that we got from Kunal observes that there's a lot of innovation on the capture side of things, but he sees that there's less being done on the storage front, storage being very capital intensive. Is there an interest to promote storage-based solutions? And how do you envision such providers take benefit of the AMCs that Shopify and Frontier are procuring?
And that's such an important question. We do have storage providers, like standalone storage providers in our portfolio, like 4401. Recently we added Sella. We have Concrete with Carbon Cure and Carbon Built, who are ready to receive captured CO2. And it's so critical because we have to match them up. You know, we have to make sure that, like, if direct air capture proves itself from a technology perspective, we got to put that CO2 somewhere. And if we don't have the development of the storage solutions at the same time, it doesn't help us, right? And so it's critical to support both. And we do that through our core funding as well as through the Frontier procurement mechanism. So that's part of the solution. And one of the things that we really like about some of the companies that are out there is that they're able to co-locate, and perhaps they're not as dependent on the local geology. Like the concrete solutions, every major city has multiple concrete production facilities on the perimeter because we're always building. So if we're able to do direct air capture or another activity and co-locate that way, it opens up more options for a new carbon removal industry to provide jobs to local communities, for example. So there's a lot of pros to that.
That's great. Excellent. And I think we have time for one more. How do you value things like biodiversity? It's questions from Max. How do you value things like biodiversity or local sort of social impacts or climate justice impacts in your selection process?
It's such an important question. The first principle we have is do no harm. So we want to understand what the impacts are of the technology, the solution, the company, the site that's being proposed. But do no harm is just the base case. We have to do better than that, and we have the opportunity to do better than that. So once we're comfortable with like the carbon negativity, like this is going to work, okay, great. But let's talk about what are the negative impacts, or what are going to be the benefits of that project, and how should they be shared with the community? Those are all very open questions. And so for me, having a background in government, you know, it comes down to a lot of requirements for public consultation and engagement with local communities, because we're going to see a transition from fossil fuel. It's not going to be pretty. There's going to be job loss. It's going to be regionally impactful. And there's an opportunity for carbon removal and new industry to try to pick that up and to ease that transition by locating in the same areas or trying to employ people with the transferable skill set. Those things are really important. In terms of biodiversity, I think one of the things that we see, especially with the nature-based solutions, is that we're like, you can get a carbon negative project and you can look at them and they're all about the same and they're all about the same price point, but where they set each other apart is on those co-benefits. And what are they doing for the socioeconomic environment of that community? What are they doing for biodiversity? What is the specific habitat that's being either protected or restored? And those things are critical. And that's what's actually going to get a buyer to make a purchase is that, because you can go and get a lot of those kinds of carbon projects, but the co-benefits are what will set a company apart or a project.
Thank you so much. That's all the time we have for in terms of audience Q&A. Toby, do you want to take it away? Thank you so much.
And thank you, Irene. And Audience, those are great questions. Thank you so much for being with us and for asking all those questions. We're sorry we couldn't get to them all, but we do need to stop at the top of the hour. And Stacy, we know you're super busy with all of your work at Shopify, and we're very pleased and honored that you were able to join us today. It was really great. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. This was awesome.
Take care. We'll see you soon.
Bye, everyone.
A couple programming notes that we're going to close with here. First of all, super exciting news. Yesterday, out of the Garden State of New Jersey, Governor Phil Murphy signed the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act, which is an amazing piece of legislation to get the public sector to start procuring low carbon concrete. And if my screen loads, you'll see an excellent graphic that Chris Neidl put together. And so this is multiple years of work. We do have a bill that passed in New York that Chris Neidl was instrumental in getting up and running. This bill is, I think, even a better bill and a stronger bill. And it really, I want to just call out Sue Dorward and Sean Moen, who are Open Air members and advocates who've been working on this for over 2 years and just like unrelenting, and they've got it over the finish line. It's a huge achievement. We're actually doing a program next Wednesday, and Chris will put a link in the chat to register for it, but just to pull some of these advocates together to talk about how this happened and how can you do this in your state. And Open Air would love to support anyone who's interested in trying to get a low carbon concrete procurement bill passed in their state or jurisdiction, whether it's here in the US or nationally. And Stacy just put a link to her buyer's guide in the chat, which is amazing. Everyone should check it out. So everyone, please join this webinar. And again, way to go, Sue and Sean and our partners at NRDC and your New Jersey legal conservation voters. This was a big achievement. What else do we have? Chris will also put a link in the chat to our website. You can check out the missions we're working on. And there's a really diverse set of projects, and we'd love to have you be a part of them. And another legislative project from Open Air, we have a Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act introduced in the state of Massachusetts by the great Senate Majority Leader there, Cindy Crean, who is super powerful. We think the bill has great prospects. It basically gets the state of Massachusetts to start acting like Shopify and Frontier and buying early stage carbon removal projects. So there will be a link to that text in the chat. We need anyone who lives in Massachusetts, please help us. Chris, maybe there's a link to the email template that's in the show notes, but we have email templates so that you can contact your local representative and get them to support the bill, which is really much needed. So lots going on there. And then upcoming on This is CDR, we have Robert Hoagland, as mentioned, and CDR FYI next week, which will be, I think, really complementary to what Stacy talked about today. And Robert's amazing, and he will be dialing in from the middle of the night in Bangkok. So we're very excited to have him. Carbon to Stone, which is a recent Frontier purchase. It's a really innovative and interesting direct air capture company that comes out of the research of Dr. Grishma Gadikota from Cornell University here in New York. She's fantastic. She's going to give a great presentation, and it's a super exciting new DAC pathway that works with industrial waste and also brings its own storage, so it doesn't require CO2 sequestration, which is important in a state like New York where we do not have good geologic sequestration opportunities for CO2. We'll be announcing more of This is CDR soon. Thank you for being with us today. We're right on the hour. Please join us next week with Robert Hoagland, and we will see you then. Thanks a lot, and everyone be well, and we'll see you next week.